In this video, I'm going to go over the features of the Toneblock 202 from Quilter. Hey guys, I'm Doctor McFarland and welcome to the channel. I have been a big fan of Quilter amplifiers for a very long time. I've owned everything from the ProBlock 200, the Micro Pro 8-inch combo, the 101 mini reverb, the Interblock 45, which I still currently have. And this 202 Toneblock is on loan from a friend. You should check out his channel. He goes by Landon Cunningham. I'll have a link down in the description for his channel. He does a lot of good gear videos, and he is a tone enthusiast like me and many others out there. So thanks to him for letting me check out his amp. Let's go ahead and look at the features of the Toneblock 202. Alright, so as you see here on the iPhone screen, we have a gain, limiter, bass, mid, treble, reverb, and a master. Now the Toneblock 202 to me is really a combination of multiple different Quilter amps that have been out over the years. So let's go through each feature and I'll give you a little history of where I think all these features came from, alright? So gain is pretty obvious. You have just the normal gain, how much crunch you're going to have, or clean headroom you're going to have on the amp. The limiter is on the ProBlock 200 and also on the Micro Pro. And it's just a circuit within the amp that reduces gain to the front end. And it also compresses or limits the sound, so you get a little bit of a squish when you're dialing in your clean sound. Now bass, middle, treble, that's just a good all-around EQ section, or tone stack as most amp enthusiasts like to call it. And I do like the 3-band EQ versus having a tri-Q feature. There's just a lot more tweakability in my personal opinion. And that's one thing I didn't like so much about the ProBlock 200 was it had the tri-Q, and I could get pretty close to the sounds I was wanting most of the time, but having a 3-band EQ is definitely a lot more flexible. And of course this has a reverb, and it is a very good sounding reverb, I must say. And then the master volume goes all the way from 0 to 200 watts. Now wherever you have that master dialed in, that's going to allow whatever headroom you're going to have on the amp. So let's just go ahead and dial in a basic tone, set everything at 5 o'clock, and we're going to actually leave the limiter down. And let's have the reverb down as well. So let's just listen to a good overall tone, see where we're at. I am using the Reverend Sensei, which has rail hammer pickups, and they are a little bit hotter than some of my other Reverend guitars. So we'll be switching a few guitars here within the video so you can hear what this amp sounds like with humbuckers, single coils, and anything in between. I am going through my 2x12 cab with a vintage 30 and a greenback, and I'm pretty sure the microphone is on the vintage 30, and the mic itself is a Rode pod mic that you could use for podcasting. They're also great for vocals, and in this instance I'm using it for the guitar cab itself. So here's the clean tone. Now, because of the pickups and where the gain is set on the amp, we are getting a little bit of a crunch going on here. So without touching anything else, let's go ahead and adjust the limiter. And let's bring that up to 5 and see what happens. So I hope you can hear that extra sustain that the limiter introduces into the circuit. Let's bring it back down so you can hear the difference. You can hear a little bit more crunch out of the amp. And then as I bring up that limiter back to 5, it cleans it up and lengthens the notes or the chords just a little bit because of that natural limiting and compression that it introduces into the circuit. All right, so let's go ahead and just say that's a good overall tone. I want it to be a little bit brighter. So let's just bring up the treble and let's bring back the bass just a little bit. All right, we're still on the bridge pickup. Let's bring the treble back and the bass up. All right, so we can definitely warm that sound up a little bit by dialing back the treble. And let's just see what happens if we dime the mid-range on this amp. Alright, so it kind of has that clonish, 1 to 2K kind of nasal kind of sound. And that's really cool option if you like your harder edge tones to have a little bit of upper mid-range going on. That's a good option for that. And let's go ahead and back off the limiter and see what happens now. All right, great. So a lot of mid-range, a lot of upper mids going on there. Let's go ahead and bring up the gain as well, and let's bring down the master just to kind of level things out. All right, so that's a pretty smooth rock tone right there. Sounds really good. So if you like the Marshall JCM 800 or just a good one channel head, then maybe that's a good tone for you. And, check out those settings on the amps. You can dial that in on your own. All right, let's go ahead and bring up the limiter at that point, see what happens. All right, so once again, the limiter is going to reduce gain to the front end and just clean it up a little bit. Let's dial back the mids now and let's crank up the gain all the way. Well, actually, let's leave the mids where they were. All right, here we go. All right, so one thing, this is my personal opinion here. One thing about the Quilter amps is once they get to really high gain settings, they kind of have this underlying, way it breaks up. It's just something going on there that's not quite tube-like. It's just doing something different. So maybe that's not a big issue for you, but what I'm hearing here in the room, it's just, let me hit a chord, you can hear it again. There's something girthy in that lower mids, but the breakup doesn't sound that smooth. But I am hearing some upper end harmonics ringing out over the top. So, you kind of get what you get with this amp. But with it being a one channel amp, and you can't really, switch channels from clean to dirty and back and forth, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to use the amp, find a good core tone that you like, and then you're just going to hit it with pedals anyway. And that's the great thing about the Quilter amps, is they do take pedals really, really well. And we're going to plug in some pedals here in a little bit so you can test that out. But what I do like to do, if I'm going to crank the gain a little bit, I'm going to probably have it around 3 o'clock and not so much that 5 o'clock area. Let's listen to it now. Now that sound right there it's a good edge of breakup sound, because you got the sustain from the limiter, but the gain is not so over the top that you still can't clean it up. So check this out. And with that, folks, you have a nice clean sound with the gain still up, but the limiter is hindering that gain from poking through a lot more. And then you can dial in the mids and the treble to your taste, and just kind of set the master volume to where it fits the room and your situation that you're in. You don't want to blow out your bandmates, but at the same time, you do want plenty of headroom where you can be heard in a loud situation if you need to. Alright, so let's go ahead and check out the reverb. This is with the reverb all the way up on 10. It's definitely not a spring reverb. It's probably more like a hall or a chamber, but it still sounds really, really good. So at this point, I like the sound I have on the amp. Let's go ahead and switch guitars and listen for the differences in pickup type with these same settings on the amp. This is my Reverend Jetstream 390. It has 3 P90 pickups. And if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you probably recognize this guitar. So P90s have a little different sound than a regular single coil. Have a little bit more mid-range, probably a little bit more bottom end. And so let's go ahead and check out the settings on the amp and see what this guitar sounds like through the Toneblock 202. Alright, here's the neck pickup. The sound is good. I think it's probably a little too girthy. So what I can do is probably back off on the bass. Alright, I brought up the limiter just a little bit to back off the gain even more, and it helps to clean it up, but also lengthen out the chords and notes. Alright, let's go ahead and take down the limiter and bring up the gain again. Back to the bridge pickup. Alright, still a good sound, but I'm going to keep it on the clean side here. Alright, so this whole time we've been on the vintage Q setting, and I'm going to bring it over to full Q, just like that, and then let's listen to the sound. Alright, back to the vintage voice. So automatically I hear a chime, more top end in the vintage versus the full Q, which is perfectly fine. So if we go back to full Q and maybe just bring up the treble. So I think you can get similar results by messing around with the full Q versus vintage mode and also dialing in the treble knob a little bit. But that treble frequency is going to sit in a different spot depending on which voicing you have it on. So you can probably get them both to sound pretty similar. At the end of the day, it's all about ease of use and how you can get there quicker to get your overall sound. Now, this does have a FRFR. Let's just see what that sounds like. It's definitely a lot more gain, a lot more presence. It's probably going to be similar to plugging into the effects return on your amplifier, and because it just has a very flat response, obviously because it's FRFR, and it's not really meant to color your sound. Now I do have a headrush gig board back behind me. We can plug that in and run it through the amp and see what that sounds like, and that's probably a pretty good idea. So let's go ahead and get that set up. Alright, if you've also watched my channel for any length of time, you know I'm a huge headrush pedal board enthusiast, and it's a great digital mauler that sounds very, very natural, and I use it for all my live and studio recording. So I've kind of gone away from physical amplifiers here in the last about year or so, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate a good either solid state or tube based amplifier. So the Quilter Toneblock 202 does have a FRFR option on there. So you get a very flat response on your preamp section of the amp, and you don't have to rely on using the effects return of an amplifier to bypass the overall preamp and just use it as a power amp. So let me pick a good rig here on the gig board, and then we'll listen to how that sounds going through the cab. So let me explain my setup here. I'm going guitar into the headrush gig board, left mono out of the gig board into the regular old input on the Toneblock 202. I'm going to go between the three different modes on the Toneblock so you can hear how the gig board responds to the different preamp sounds on the Toneblock. I have a Princeton reverb set up on the gig board as well as a 1x12 cab, probably with a Royer 121 ribbon microphone off axis. So this is what that sounds like through the full Q. Alright, let's go over to vintage, just for fun, to see how it sounds. And here is FRFR. One thing I do like to do on the headrush when I'm using a physical amp and cab is I'll bypass the cab within the rig, so that way I don't have a virtual cab and a physical cab in the same signal path. So let's go ahead and bypass that. here's the cab back in. All right, it sounds a little bit darker to me. So we're gonna take that back out. All right, cool. I like that sound. And that's my traditional setup when I use a physical amp. I just run it into the effects return, therefore bypassing the preamp of the physical amp, and then I'm using the digital preamp of the Headrush gig board or full-size Headrush pedal board, whichever one I'm using. So I like that sound. That's a good setup. Let's go ahead and introduce some other effects, and let's bring in some delays, some overdrive, some reverbs, and so on. All right, so here's a reverb sound from the gig board. And here's another one. And here's some auto swell, reverse delay, pitch delay, and reverb. Alright, honestly, I love using a digital unit with a physical amp and cab because I get the flexibility of using tons of different amps and effects, all the reverbs, delays that I want, and I just have a good power amp and cab on stage, especially if I'm doing like a jam or like a rock band kind of thing. Now, if I'm playing at church, obviously I'm just going direct out of the Headrush. But in a situation where I can have a physical amp and cab, then I do like having that option. Let's go ahead and listen to the same setup, but now I just have all the wet effects off and I have a tube screamer in the circuit. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and turn the amp up all the way. Once again, it's a Princeton reverb, so I'm just naturally cranking it up, and then we're going to hear how that sounds through the 202 and the cab. And here's the same sound with a tube screamer. Alright, I've dialed back the volume on the amp, and now we're listening to a full tone OCD, which the Headrush calls the anxiety overdrive. Now I swapped rigs on the gig board, and I'm using a Ola England metal sound that he created for the Headrush. So let's check that one out. Alright, that does have the cab in the signal chain, so let me take that out. So this is essentially the SLO 100 extended range with a tube screamer in front of it. here's one last rig using a PV5150 in a metal style setup. Alright, so that's the main gist of the voices. Let's go ahead and check out the signal out, which is supposed to have a good cab simulation sound, so you don't have to use a microphone live if you don't want to. So let's go ahead and connect the signal out into my mic pre and listen to how the mic sounds versus the signal out sounds. Alright, so I'm back, just plugged into the 202, no headrush gig board is in the chain. And as you can see, I have a cable going from the signal out into my Warm Audio 412 mic pre, and then that in turn is going into the PreSonus Studio Live mixing board and recording in the Reaper. So I have the mic signal that I've been recording this whole time plugged in as well, so we can A/B the two mics and hear how they sound. Alright, so let's just play a little bit, and then in post I will swap back and forth between the mic and signal out chain so you can hear how that sounds. Alright guys, there you go. That is the Quilter Toneblock 202. And I think is a great amp if you need a little extra headroom and you want the added feature of the vintage voicing mode. Then go ahead and pick you up the Toneblock. If you want to upgrade from another model that you already have, let's say you have the Pro Block 200 and you like having the 3-band EQ as well as the FRFR option, then I would say that would be a good upgrade for you. If you have the 101 mini reverb like I did, and you don't really need all those extra features, and 50 watts is plenty of headroom for you, then I would say just stick with what you have.